So welcome everyone to our panel, Internalized Stigma, Dangers, Resilience, and Intersectionality. My name is Emily Petty. I'm a current PhD student in clinical psychology at the University of California, Irvine. And I'll be co-chairing this panel with Dr. Joe DeLuca. Joe, if you want to give a quick intro.
Sure, thanks, Emily. Yes, good morning, good afternoon or evening, wherever people are coming from. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, Joe DeLuca, Joe is fine. And I'm currently a clinical psychologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City, primarily focusing on stigma and psychosis. So really excited to talk about stigma with you all today.
Great, yeah. So during our panel today, we'll be providing a brief overview of the meaning of internalized stigma and why it's important to pay attention to, among other forms of stigma. We'll discuss hazards of internalized stigma and ways to resist it across mental health, HIV, intersectional identities, disclosure questions, labeling, vulnerable situations, advocacy, and personal experiences. And today we'll be hearing from several wonderful speakers. So I'll just let you know briefly who our speakers are, and then they'll tell you more about who they are and their work. So first we'll be hearing from Dr. Kristin Kasilik, an assistant professor of mental health law and policy at the University of South Florida and director of the Stigma Action Research Lab. So her research focuses on recovery among people with mental illness, with an emphasis on understanding and addressing stigma as a barrier to recovery. And she's currently the principal investigator of a grant looking at the effectiveness of an internalized stigma reduction program called Up to Me. Next, we'll hear from Larry Bryant. Larry is the National Education Manager for NAMI Peer-to-Peer at the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. Larry is committed to advocacy and inclusivity and eliminating the stigma associated with mental illness, HIV, and broadly within the health and mental health care systems. Our third speaker will be Rick Guasco, who is the creative director at Positively Aware magazine and the creator of the magazine's anti-stigma campaign, A Day with HIV. Rick is a passionate advocate who is interested in coexisting conditions for people aging with HIV, intergenerational opportunities for people living with HIV, telehealth, and bridging the digital divide. Finally, we'll be led in some discussion and reflection by Dr. Alicia Luckstead, who's a clinical community research psychologist at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and the Veterans Health Administration, where her work focuses on improving people's experiences of mental health services in the public sector and reducing the harms caused by internalized or self-stigma. If you have questions during the panel, please feel welcome to put all questions in the chat. We'll take a few after each speaker and then have some more time for Q&A at the end. And now I'll hand it over to Joe to talk about the concept of internalized stigma.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, so I'll just give a quick background because we're going to be diving into these topics today. So just want to start off with a quick definition. I'm sure we all know, being at an International Stigma Conference, but we know, right, the stigma, prejudice, discrimination, right, can create a hostile, stressful social environment that can cause mental health problems, that can exacerbate problems and stressors for folks. And this is a great slide that actually I know Alicia has shared before, and she shared this with me and has borrowed it from others. And I think it really highlights this phenomenon very well, that we need to be cleaning up this stigma. It's a complex issue, just like air pollution, right? It's kind of in the air, it's complex, it's stubborn, various sources. And I think we are making progress overall, certainly with this conference being a nice foundation to discuss these topics and hear about all the wonderful work that people are doing. But we also know in the meantime, people still are navigating these systems and dealing with a lot of stigma. And stigma can manifest in a lot of ways. And internalized stigma is one of those ways, right, that we're discussing today. So you can go to the next slide, please, Emily. Great, thank you. And internalized stigma, right, it's simply accepting and sort of applying these stereotypes to ourselves. So an example of mental illness, which I know we'll be talking about more today, would be something like, feeling like your whole identity is overwhelmed by the stigmatized label, right? Mental illness, or whatever label you might use or that's been applied to you. And really the process that we think about would be ideal is helping people to sort of see that label, those stigmatized conditions as, yes, it can be a part of you, however much of a part of you want it to be, but you're also so much more, right? You're a multifaceted person with a lot of strengths and resilience. But we do know, unfortunately, in societies, in places where there's high levels of public stigma, people living with mental illness, with other stigmatized conditions, also have high levels of internalized stigma. So really something that we need to be talking about. So you go to the next slide, please, Emily, thank you. And this kind of highlights it here, sort of, these common stereotypes in society, again, sort of targeted to mental illness here as an example. The public generally believing that people with mental illness might be frightening or dangerous or violent or unreliable in some way. And unfortunately, what we know from the research, at least in the mental health stigma area, is that this stigma is on the rise in the United States and in some other parts of the world, such that actually now close to 70% of the US public believes that someone with psychosis or a serious mental illness will be violent, where we know compared to the research that is just not true. Most people with mental illness are never violent, the majority are never. But again, we do know that these stereotypes, they're in the air, it's like pollution, they can become internalized, right? People can come to believe them, right? Think that, oh, I might be dangerous or I might not be able to recover. And this can really impact, recovery, can exacerbate symptoms, a whole cycle of really nasty things. And yes, quick definition, wonderful, thanks, Emily. And I won't go into this into too much detail here because I know we'll be talking about it more today. But this is just a bit of a formation of the internalized stigma process, right? There's an awareness that there are these stereotypes in society. Then there is some level of agreement with these stereotypes or accepting them sort of into yourself. And then you see it's a bit more of a complicated process here, and you could have different outcomes. And one of those can be, again, sort of the self or internalized stigma. Those are usually used as synonymous terms that, again, can lead to this loss of self-esteem, this loss of self-efficacy, right? And I think this is a nice quote that I borrowed from one of Alicia's slides. So thanks again for sending that. And I think it captures as well, right? Be careful how you're talking to yourself because you are listening, right? And again, this isn't to place blame on people with stigmatized conditions, right? This is a societal issue at the root that we need to target, but it really does impact people on an individual level. So let me stop there. Really excited for our presenters today. So I'll turn it back to you, Emily.
Great, thanks so much, Joe, for that overview. And next we'll pass it off to Kristin.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, Joe. And thanks for your introduction of us all, Emily. As Emily shared, my name is Kristin Kasilik, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we can understand and address internalized stigma or self-stigma. And I have of mental illness here in parentheses because although we can't make exact parallels between all stigmatized conditions and mental illness, there are some shared common experiences of internalized stigma, particularly for conditions that can be concealed. And I'm going to talk a little bit, as Emily mentioned in her introduction of me, about an internalized stigma reduction program that focuses on disclosure in just a bit. So next slide, please, Emily. So I am the director of the Stigma Action Research Lab, or STAR Lab, at USF. And if you were so inclined, you could scan this QR code and visit our website. I'm going to share with you a few different projects we're working on, but we're constantly updating the site with the newer research that we have going on in the lab. Go ahead to the next slide. So the mission of our lab is to conduct community engaged research, which means that every single one of our research projects involves a community partner. And we really strive for those research partnerships to be truly partnerships. And so I'll tell you some examples of that when I talk about the research that we're doing around internalized stigma. So our research really emphasizes stigma surrounding behavioral health conditions, though I am starting to do some work in other areas as well with other stigmatized conditions. And we're hopeful that our work and our research findings lead to real world impact. Okay, so Joe, you did a fantastic job of describing stigma. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how we talk about stigma in the work. This is how we conceptualize stigma in the work that we do. So we talk about these three different constructs that comprise the stigma process. The first are stereotypes, which are the almost always untrue beliefs that we hold about a stigmatized group. Prejudice is our emotional reaction to those stereotypes, and discrimination is the behavioral response. And then we talk about commonly four different types of stigma. One is public stigma. So that's, Joe mentioned 70% of the public endorses these stereotypes of dangerousness around psychosis. So that's what the general public believes about the stigmatized group and how they react to that belief emotionally and behave towards the group as a result. Self-stigma is when somebody is aware of those stereotypes and internalizes them. And they, as a result, experience a loss of self-esteem or self-efficacy. Label avoidance is when people avoid the label of mental illness by avoiding things like services that could place that label upon them. And then structural stigma is when stigma makes its way into law or legislation. So an example of structural stigma would be the belief that people with mental illness are somehow to blame for their mental health condition and therefore don't deserve to have health coverage like other conditions might receive. And so we see a lack of mental health parity. That would be the manifestation of structural stigma. And then we also talk about these kind of vehicles for change. So if we know what stigma is, how can we address it? One approach is protest. So that's, if you see a stigmatizing representation in a movie, you might protest that movie. Education is contrasting the myths with the facts surrounding mental illness. And contact is facilitating interactions between people living with a mental illness and others, so that the general public, if we want to put it that way, comes to see that people living with mental illness are just like everybody else. Next slide, please, Emily. Okay, so you saw a version of this slide in Joe's slides. And as Joe mentioned, we kind of use the terms internalized stigma and self-stigma interchangeably. So what this diagram is showing is that we hold these collective representations of people living with mental illness. And when these representations are primed, which happens when we hear a label or see something that we think represents a mental health condition, then we react negatively to this prime if we do endorse the stigma. So that's the perceived legitimacy piece. If we believe that the stereotype is true, and then we apply it to the individual. So somebody living with a mental health condition, if they are aware of the stereotypes, and I always say that really we're so aware of stereotypes because they're just, really prevalent especially in our media. If they're aware of the stereotype and they identify themselves as living with a mental health condition, they see the stereotype as true, which means it's high perceived legitimacy on the right-hand side of the slide here, then that's when they suffer a loss of self-esteem or self-efficacy as a result, if they highly identify with the group. If not, there's a couple of other outcomes that might take place. They could either be indifferent to stigma, so if they don't view themselves as living with a mental health condition, or they don't agree with the stereotypes, they could either be indifferent. And then at the very left-hand side of the slide here is a group that we call people experiencing righteous anger or stigma resistors. So these are people who do not believe the stereotypes. They believe they live with a mental health condition. They might highly identify with the group. And as a result, they become advocates commonly. Next slide, please, Emily. One thing I didn't mention, you don't have to go back in the slides, is in terms of the prevalence of self-stigma, like how many people living with a serious mental illness internalize the stigma, it's around a third. So it's a sizable portion of people living with mental health conditions that actually experience self-stigma. So I mentioned these cognitive primes, these labels that might bring about stigma or the internalization of stigma. And I think it's really important that we recognize that there are actually pros and cons to labeling, especially when it comes to a diagnosis. So the pros is a label can facilitate treatment. I hear all the time from people living with mental health conditions that when they received a diagnosis, they experienced this sense of relief. They finally had an explanation for some of the challenges that they were going through and some of the symptoms they were experiencing. Also, if we identify with a label and others also identify with that label, this facilitates peer support in some respects. But there are some significant cons. So oftentimes the labeling or the diagnosis process is seen as kind of the instigator of the internalization of stigma. So somebody receives the label and all of a sudden, all of those stereotypes become applicable to them, and they internalize stigma. And then I love that diagram that you showed, Joe. I use that all the time with the circles. And on the left-hand side of that diagram, where it was a little circle of me and a big circle of mental illness, that's called role engulfment. So that's when somebody, we have all of these identities, mother, professor, artist. And when we internalize stigma and experience this role engulfment, all of those identities seem so small compared to the experience of the mental illness. And that's really the hurt. That's what is harmful about self-stigma, is that we lose all of the other identities that we have. And the opposite, okay, so recovery is when we regain those identities. We remember all of those other parts of us, and we may still identify as a part of us being mental illness, but it's not the whole story. It's not all of us. Next slide, please, Emily. So I mentioned those common vehicles for change, and those are really when we're talking about addressing public stigma. Some of them are applicable to self-stigma, but there are some other approaches that we use to addressing internalized or self-stigma. So one approach is psychoeducation. So, educating people about what stigma is. When I'm, talking about the topic of stigma, people usually are saying, yes, I get it. That is exactly what I've experienced. I remember before, getting into stigma research, I didn't really have a name for some of the things I had seen or had experienced myself. And when I started to learn about stigma, I had that same reaction. Yes, that's it. That's exactly what I have seen happen. Cognitive restructuring is, if you know cognitive behavioral therapy, it's about recognizing harmful or false beliefs and addressing that negative thought pattern, replacing it with more positive thoughts. Narrative therapy is storying. It's telling a narrative about ourselves. And acceptance and commitment therapy, that's when we recognize something that is potentially, bothersome to us or negatively influencing us, and we come to accept that that is happening and move forward and move past it. Peer support is exactly as it sounds. It's people who have a shared experience. In this case, I'm talking about the shared experience of mental illness, coming together and experiencing a sense of commonality and shared experiences. And then disclosure is, again, exactly as it sounds. It's sharing with others the fact that you are living, in this case, with a mental health condition. And then many of the stigma change programs that exist combine some combination of these approaches. So there's one called Narrative Enhancement and Cognitive Therapy that I've done a little bit of work with, which is a combination of psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, narrative therapy, and I would argue peer support as well. That program was developed by Filianos and colleagues. I know Alicia has a program called Ending Self-Stigma that maybe if we have time, she'll tell us a little bit about. And then the program that I'm currently evaluating among a college student population is called, it's called Honest, Open, Proud. The college version is called Up to Me. So it's up to me to decide about disclosing my mental health condition. And that is a combination of psychoeducation, disclosure, and peer support. Next slide, please. So we have a variety of different research projects going on in the STAR lab. But if you go to the next slide, it should highlight, the projects that I would say are focusing on internalized stigma. So I'll tell you quickly about each of these. And Emily, you can let me know if I'm running close on time. If you want to go to the next slide. Thanks. So the first one I want to tell you about is This Is My Brave. This Is My Brave is a national anti-stigma organization, a nonprofit. Their hashtag is storytelling saves lives. And I can't tell you how much I believe that slogan. So This Is My Brave is a contact-based stigma reduction program where they travel from city to city and they issue casting calls. In fact, I am leading the production of This Is My Brave at USF in spring of 2022. They issue casting calls calling for people living with mental illnesses to come forward and tell their stories live on stage through creative means such as monologue, poetry, song, dance. They've had a mime, you name it. And these stories are told about 10 people in a cast to a live audience. If you want to move to the next slide, Emily. So I have worked with This Is My Brave, and I should mention that This Is My Brave was co-founded by a woman named Jennifer Marshall, who herself lives with bipolar disorder. A very long time, she was blogging anonymously under the name Bipolar Mom. And she was receiving so many people's messages coming forward and saying, you know, I read your blog in my darkest days and it saved my life. So she, you know, her blog gained popularity and she eventually was contacted by, I believe it was Marie Claire magazine. And they wanted to write about her and they wanted her to tell her story, but they wanted to do it publicly. And so she was then faced with this decision, do I come out with my mental health condition? And she did. And the reaction was just this huge outpouring of support. So I've worked as the lead evaluator for This Is My Brave for the past 6 years. We've published a couple of articles and we have a couple in review. You want to move forward, Emily? So of the research that we've done, I hope that you can't hear too much dog barking in the background. Of the research that we've done, the left-hand side here is a pilot study that we did. We actually went into the theaters and gave people a survey before and after they watched a performance of This Is My Brave. And we asked them questions about their levels of stigma around mental illness, if they believed that people were capable of recovery, and whether or not they would be willing to seek treatment if they experienced a mental health condition themselves. And you can see here in this slide that there were significant reductions in stigma from before to after watching the show, improvements in the belief that people are capable of recovery, and improvements in willingness to seek treatment. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, what you're seeing is we did a randomized controlled trial. So just a little bit more rigorous of a research design. This one was done online. We compared This Is My Brave to a comparison condition, which was we had Jennifer Marshall and a couple other individuals record their stories, but just in a straightforward manner, as opposed to through creative means. And then we had a control condition, which was a video on virtual reality, I believe. And what we found is that desired social distance significantly decreased for both This Is My Brave and the straightforward storytelling condition. No change for the control condition. So desired social distance is a proxy of discrimination. The more social distance we want from people with mental illness, the more we are likely to discriminate against them. And then perceived difference. That significantly decreased for This Is My Brave, but not for the other groups. So why is that important? The more different we perceive ourselves to be from an individual with a stigmatized label, the more likely we are to stigmatize them. Next slide, Emily. So how is this related to internalized stigma? This is some preliminary data on the storytellers, which I think is just so powerful. So these storytellers come forward and tell their stories live on stage. They bond as a cast, which is a form of peer support, right? And what we've found is that the folks who come forward and tell their stories experience a significant increase in their level of empowerment between prior to their casting and after they tell their story. to the live audience. They also improve in terms of self-esteem and self-efficacy and their sense of having a power over their lives. So again, these are just preliminary findings. We're continuing to gather data, and I'm excited to see what we find next. Okay, so it is important that we target stigma change messages to different communities. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there are a couple special editions of This Is My Brave that we have done. USF, after the murder of George Floyd, issued some internal grants that were focused on understanding Blackness and anti-Black racism. And so my colleague, Kaya Connor, and I, who you see at the bottom here, we received one of these grants to do This Is My Brave stories from the Black community. We found across the board positive outcomes, including among both Black and white viewers, improvements in anti-racism. If you go to the next slide. Okay. Great, Emily, thank you. I should be good then. As I mentioned, I'm producing a This Is My Brave College Edition show in the spring. I'm gonna go to the next slide. There's also a high school edition show. Okay, so that's it for This Is My Brave. I'm gonna quickly, in the next 2 minutes, tell you about just a couple other programs. One is NAMI's Peer-to-Peer, which Larry mentioned. He is a peer-to-peer facilitator, correct, Larry? Peer-to-peer is a group that's facilitated by people living with mental illness for people living with mental illness. And you can see here, there's these key components of the group, just different lessons that are learned within that program. And there's all these expected outcomes related to stigma, one of them being a reduction in self-stigma. So I did a really small pilot study, a randomized trial looking at the influence on self-stigma, and found significant reductions in self-stigma, specifically the hurt, so that loss in self-esteem and self-efficacy among the participants, also increases in willingness to ask for help and improvements in recovery. Next slide, please, Emily. So this is just a disclaimer that this is funded work by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, and it's what I'm saying here is my opinions and not theirs. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is the Up to Me intervention. So this is a disclosure-based intervention. I'm not sure if we'll be sharing these slides, but there is a link that maybe we can post it in the chat or something. I could do that after, that describes this program. Basically, it's a peer group program facilitated by, in this case, college students living with mental health conditions, where it helps people to weigh the pros and cons around disclosure. The goal being not to convince people to disclose, but to have the power to decide, because most people feel that they can't disclose because of stigma. If they do decide to disclose, how do they do so safely? And then how do they craft their disclosure story so that they're achieving the goals that they want? And for college students, that could be peer support, that could be getting accommodations. Okay, last slide now, Emily. Actually second to last, but we can probably stop here. So stigma resistance, I have already mentioned, we're right now, so that's when people resist the stigma and they do not internalize it. We're actually conducting a systematic review of the literature right now, looking at multiple different concealable stigmatized identities like HIV, LGBTQ+ identities, and so forth, mental illness, and looking at what strategies people use to resist stigma. So just so I don't eat into anybody else's time, I'll skip past the mental health unity slide. That's the next slide. But if people want to ask about that when we talk, that's great. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kristin. We did have one, I think, excellent question that came through in the chat specifically that I think would be great for you to answer. So someone asked, does labeling help someone who wants to resist prove themselves as worthwhile?
If I'm understanding, that's a really interesting question. If I'm understanding correctly, and I would love if the person would clarify if I don't answer this correctly. So sometimes people feel that their experience isn't legitimate. That unless they, here's a concrete example, unless I've had a psychiatric hospitalization, I haven't really struggled with mental illness. So in those cases, people might, internalize stigma and not be able to resist it because they're not feeling that their experience is valid. So in that case, identifying with the label, owning the label of living with a mental health condition can facilitate that righteous anger that we might experience as a result of the stigma that surrounds mental illness. And I would imagine that would facilitate stigma resistance for sure. You're welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. And yes, with that, we will pass the baton to Larry.
Thank you, Emily. And I just put it to the chat. Wow, it was a perfect transition question to what I'm going to speak about. And that is kind of talking about the intersectionality of stigma and how it affects all of us, and particularly how it's internalized and grows within the individual who it impacts. So when we talk about intersectionality, what are we talking about? The interconnected nature, right, of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, as they apply to myself or individual, a group, and then it's regarded as creating kind of this overlapping and interdependent system of discrimination or disadvantages or labeling. But what I'm kind of interested in is kind of peeling back the intersectionality and talking about the avenues, the streets, the alleys that lead to those intersections, and how those, especially for like someone like me who's living with HIV since 1986, how those conditions impacted that internal stigma, those internal stereotypes impact individuals long before HIV enters their life. So we're talking about, personal issues or family issues, dysfunctional, destructive forces happening within the family, environmental challenges, growing up in poverty, growing up in disadvantaged communities, living with an undiagnosed mental illness, drug usage, housing instability, all these individual impacts and influences are by themselves destructive and damaging, and then internalized. So each individual not only is living through that issue or that dynamic, but it's also reinforced by the society and environment and the community around them. So, a couple of examples of that is, in 1996, Andrew Sullivan writes that, in his article, When Plagues End, at the beginning of when Ryan White and combination therapies and treatments were being provided to people, gay white men like himself had access to many of these life-saving treatments and medications. And therefore, again, in 1996, he wrote that for him and people like him, the plague, as he put it, was over. AIDS was over. But at the same time, the rising number of new infections, of people living with HIV and AIDS around the country were rising, and Black women were pretty much the highest on that list. And then to go into 2004, the vice presidential campaign with Dick Cheney and John Edwards sitting at a table with Gwen Ifill, where Gwen Ifill poses the question to both candidates what they would do to address the rising epidemic among Black women. Obviously, Gwen Ifill, a Black woman herself, asking these two men, what would their strategy be to help lessen the new infections among Black women in regards to HIV in this country? And neither had an answer. It was one of the few times during that entire debate that they actually looked at each other. By the way, side note, also during that, because I rewatched it last night, talk about a glutton for punishment, but Dick Cheney also said that we would have democracy in Afghanistan. So you can take all that as seriously as you would like to. But again, that's the reinforcement of that internal stigma. So growing up in a community where you've seen, communities, especially here in DC, there's east of the river, southeast DC, impoverished, marginalized communities have this sense that no one is coming to rescue them. No one is coming to address the needs in their community. And then to see on TV two people that one, could be the second most important person on the planet, essentially ignore you, can't identify you, and has no solutions for you, articulated on the national or international stage, again, reinforced. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1986 and was scared to death to come out and talk about it because of the fear that I grew up with around sexuality and how that was drilled into me about being a straight boy and what that was supposed to look like and what that was supposed to sound like. So I went 5 years before I told anyone of my diagnosis. And it wasn't until Magic Johnson disclosed publicly in 1991 that I saw someone that helped me identify myself or re-identify myself. And it gave me a little bit of support, positive reinforcement to be able to address that fear that had been pounding on me all those years, and many people like me. And to give, I guess, another example of the mental health issue, I attempted suicide in high school, largely because I grew up living with depression, anxiety, undiagnosed. I had no idea that was going on in my head, and I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to share it. And therefore I didn't know how to identify it. And as a young boy playing football and being a boy, I was encouraged to shake it off, don't talk about it. If I wanted to get go to college on a scholarship, I can't let coaches or recruiters know what was going on in my brain, what was going on in my head. I was not allowed to talk about it. So therefore, I felt like I was just imploding as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, and I had no idea how to address it. And the only escape at the time that I had was to end my life. And then, again, this is years before HIV ever entered my life. And moving forward, like it's been said, I work with NAMI now. I work with a lot of individuals who are living with mental illness or who are learning to identify and cope and establish recovery plans to be able to identify treatment and answers that can help shape how to just kind of reclaim their confidence, reclaim their lives, and get to a point where they feel comfortable talking to someone outside, a mental health professional, talking to a doctor, getting other issues met. But because of the layered nature of how this intersectionality works, I mean, I know we talk about it in public health conversations around, when you're addressing a person, when you're providing health or resources or interventions for a person, treat the person, not the illness. But what do you do when the person you want to treat is not allowed to be the person they are? And these bands of intersectionality become not just intersections or parallel kind of avenues that run into intersections, but they become like a stranglehold to those who are trying to seek help. So when the question comes up, like how do these individual sources of stigma, individual sources of whether it's homophobia, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, all these different things. If you're a person living with using drugs, how is that seen? If you have a combination of those things, it just becomes far more difficult to breathe. It feels like this, like you're being strangled. But what are solutions to this? I mean, obviously the increase Hopefully the increase continues of more peer-led programs, individuals who are able to talk about their experiences from where they come from, not just limited to HIV, but all those different aspects combined. Again, a program we have at NAMI called In Our Own Voice focuses on individuals living with mental illness who provide presentations in their own voice that help to change the attitudes, the assumptions and ideas of people who live with mental health conditions. It's an opportunity to hear whether you're someone living with a mental health challenge, whether you're someone living with HIV, whether you're someone who is a returning citizen, individuals in our trans community provide honest and open perspectives of what they see or what the world sees as these highly understood topics. I mean, ignorance is a whole nother thing. There are people who just don't want to kind of turn the pages and understand the layers of who we are as people, as humans. But having more people in these programs, in these local community organizations, in these national HIV organizations, people living with HIV, people who represent the epidemic and represent the issues that impact them most, talking about their challenges and talking about their successes and the journey in between, I think is something we need to focus on more. And hopefully in platforms like this, where we have experts in a variety of fields coming together to talk about all the different challenges and the new innovations and being able to communicate and access, or provide access, increase access for those who are kind of locked out. We need to have more of these open and honest conversations led by people who are sitting in the intersection, coming again from those streets, those alleys, those avenues where they have evolved and kind of grown to become the whole person that they are now. We need to focus on the social supports, the continuum of care for people much earlier than we're getting to them. Again, making sure that we also understand that internalized fear, stigma, pain is continually reinforced by the environment around us. We have to be able to address both. So again, that we're making sure that we're treating the whole individual so that they can be a whole individual. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. And if you haven't had a chance to see the chat, we're getting so many messages thanking you for such a powerful presentation. Really glad that you're here speaking with us this morning. And one question that we got in the Whova chat, which would be great if you could speak to a little bit, is can internalized stigma be lifelong?
I feel like it's a trick question. Yes, it can be lifelong. I mean, it's hard. I guess you have to start with how do you quantify it? How do you measure that stigma? And I talked about this earlier. I was in the panel earlier this week with heterosexual men living with HIV, and talking about how that impacts them individually. And it's hard to address or to find solutions for the collective stigma that we live with, that is kind of surrounding us in our lives. But if we are better able to identify those individual droplets in that big cloud of stigma, we have a better chance of at least finding solutions that can help lessen it. We talk about harm reduction, lessening the pain, lessening the impact, and like mental illness, like my depression, my anxiety will not be cured. It will not disappear. My HIV will not be cured. It will not disappear. But I've developed methods to be able to treat it, to be able to live a productive and healthy and happy life with it. So in many cases, structural policies and structural interventions and things that we can do, tangible interventions, can help alleviate those stigmas, that pain, can help change the environment, improve the environment around us, continues to reintroduce that pain and trauma with us, it's like asking me, will racism end? It takes the collective effort of both ourselves, the person living with that, whatever the condition, to do the best we can with the access we have to find solutions that help us. But it also means kind of restructuring the world around us, the immediate world around us, if possible, that helps to kind of lessen that trauma as well. That's the harder challenge, especially if you're in a marginalized community and you already feel helpless. So it's a challenging question. There's even more challenging answer, but there is hope and there is examples of being able to lessen that stigma, lessen that impact, and kind of fully address that stigma. So it kind of depends.
A beautiful answer. Thank you so much, Larry. And with that, we will pass it over to Rick and also to Joe, and they're gonna have a bit of an interactive portion of the presentation here.
Awesome. Looking forward to it with you, Rick. And I want to say we are perfect on time, I think. And this has been so wonderful so far, hearing everyone's stories. This is like, this is amazing. So Rick, let me start off with a question, and this will be more conversational, like Emily said. So tell me, what was your reaction when you learned you were living with HIV?
The very first thought I had was no self-recriminations. I'm the sort of person who I always second guess myself. I often think, what if, or if only. But when I got the news, and it wasn't entirely unexpected, and I'll explain about that, I told myself, no self-recriminations. I'm not going to beat myself up about this. The horse has already left the barn. There's nothing I can do about it now. There's nothing I can do to have stopped this. So my next thought was, what do I need to do to stay alive? And the first thing was, don't beat myself up about it. Candidly, I didn't know how I got it, when I got it, or who gave it to me. And because I didn't have those answers, none of that really mattered. What mattered was going forward. And so I was like, there was a time when I was still paralyzed with fear afterwards, but eventually I came to the realization that I could only move forward with this if I was to stay alive. The reason that I discovered that I was positive was that I had actually developed a Kaposi sarcoma. This was 1992, and in that summer came the first blossoming of a spot on my left ankle. And the spots only continued to grow and spread throughout the year. But I was in such denial and paralysis of fear about it that I actually didn't get tested until December of that year. And by that time, I had nearly 100 spots throughout my face and body. For people who don't know, or who might not know what KS is, if you've ever seen pictures in the early days of people from the early days of the epidemic with those spots, lesions, clearly they have AIDS, that's what I had. In 1992, the CDC had classified Kaposi sarcoma, or KS, as an end-stage AIDS-defining illness. And so while I had decided that I was not going to become yet another AIDS victim, because of that KS, I had resolved that I was not going to become a victim of stigma. I couldn't hide my status. I couldn't deny my status anymore. So I had to accept it because anybody who saw me clearly saw that I had something and that it was AIDS. So fast forward a number of years, 2010, I was working as art director for Positively Aware magazine. And in much of this time, stigma had always been an issue for me. Like I said, I felt that the only way for me to address stigma was to confront it head on, to literally face it. And I wanted to help people face stigma in their everyday lives. And what I wanted to do was do it by normalizing life with HIV, so that it was nothing to be ashamed of, embarrassed about, but it was left up to the person to decide what that meant for themselves and how comfortable they were in doing about it. So I wanted to create a campaign, and I'd always been intrigued. In the 1970s, there was a photojournalism campaign called A Day in the Life of America. And what happened was about 200 photojournalists were dispatched across the country. And their mission was to capture 24 hours in the lives of people across the country. And I thought, what better way to normalize living with HIV than to capture a single 24-hour period in the lives of people affected by HIV. For me, normalizing meant to make a campaign whose concept was as broad as possible, because HIV affects everybody. Stigma affects everybody, regardless of their HIV status. Stigma prevents the person from finding out whether or not they have HIV. Stigma prevents somebody from going to get treatment when they know that they need it. Stigma prevents, it isolates people. It prevents people from interacting with others. And it makes people decide not to interact with somebody that they believe has HIV. So that's how A Day with HIV was born, was to capture a single day in all these different people's lives. Now, how to do it? Well, social media was just starting. So I thought, in an age of selfies, we make everybody the photographer, not just 200 people. And so the idea was that on this day, you would just take a picture of yourself doing something in your daily life. The day I chose was the Autumnal Equinox. I wanted to pick a date that meant something significant as far as a changing of the seasons, a changing in thinking was what I was going for. And quite candidly, because it was already somewhat late in the year, I chose the next equinox, which was the Autumnal Equinox, September 22nd, I think it was, on that date. And so we told people on September 22nd, capture a moment every day, give a caption that gives the time, location of your picture, and what inspired you to take that picture. What ended up happening was it was an opportunity for people to share their stories with the selfie or with a good picture. The slide that you're seeing shows this year's campaign. We had people not just across the country, but in 15 other countries around the world taking part, from Pakistan to Australia to parts of Europe and parts of Africa as well. If you could go to the next slide, Emily, please.
Rick, and if you don't mind me just asking here quick, did you anticipate this worldwide reach here? Like, what were you anticipating when you started this? It's amazing.
No, I didn't. In fact, actually, to be candid, the original name of the campaign, the first 2 years, was A Day in the Life of or rather, it was A Day with HIV in America. But after the second year, we dropped it because we were getting pictures almost from the get-go from several other countries. This is the most representation we've had from overseas, 15 other countries. But We've had people from Brazil, Taiwan, Vietnam take part in the campaign. So it's always interesting to see the various pictures. Now, I'm afraid I've talked way too much, and I have a number of slides. Emily, if you don't mind, we're just going to go through them very quickly, because what I do want to do is simply highlight how this campaign has been adopted by so many people in so many places from so many different walks of life. In fact, actually, the first picture here, I think, is a good start, because Christian, who is in Curacao, decided that he's been living life with HIV, and now at the age of 40, it's his time to be seen. And that's the point of this campaign, is for everybody, regardless of their status, regardless of their situation, to be seen and recognized. Next slide, please, Emily. In fact, actually, Sasha only found out that he was living with HIV last year, but he embraced his status and he came out. And part of his processing living with HIV has been the supportive response he's gotten from friends, family, and even strangers. So that has helped him to overcome, as he says, the fear, the shame, and the self-stigma. Next picture, please, Emily. And in fact, on September 22nd, baby Zuri was born. She was born to a woman who was told 13 years ago that she had HIV, and Ciara's first thought was, will I ever be able to have healthy kids? And sure enough, she gave birth on that day to a healthy baby girl. Next picture. People have learned to embrace their status. Elijah is a transgender young man living in Phoenix, and he informs people through education and through entertainment. He also happens to be an entertainer in the nightclub scene. Next picture. To show you that not every day with HIV is bright, sunny, and happy, Marcy took a picture of herself in the emergency room. And it's a reminder that people living with HIV face other conditions. Today with treatment, people living with HIV often have to consider other conditions, other coexisting conditions and diseases. And that's what Marcy was facing on that day with HIV. Next picture. Older people over 50 make up the majority of people living with HIV in this country. But it doesn't mean that you can't be happy, healthy, and active. And so Gabe leads a pretty active lifestyle in the face of being positive for 33 years. Next picture. Joe, to your point, Ruli is an HIV and sexual, how does he put it? A sexual health advocate, and he's living in Kenya. And I know, hearing stories from people responding to the campaign via social media, that there are many different parts of the world where it is, quite frankly, dangerous to be as visible as Ruli is about your status, or even simply about being gay. So what he's doing is very brave. Next picture. The campaign also has gotten the interest of clinicians and researchers who also take part in the campaign, and that's this picture here. Next picture, please. In contrast to baby Zuri being born on a day with HIV, Maurice in England celebrated his 80th birthday, and he's been living with HIV for 37 years. Next picture. What I want to say about Sherry is that she's one of the people who, over the years, has sent in a picture on a day with HIV. And in the course of those years, and in those pictures, you see their life journey. Marcy went from somebody who partially hid her face in her first picture to showing her face, to showing herself on vacation vacation photos. And this past year, she got married, and her husband even got into the picture. Next slide. Androna has been living with HIV. She has been going through a struggle with mental health issues, in addition to cardiovascular disease and heart disease. But one day she decided to put on a hat and be happy. And that was her picture for a day with HIV. Next picture, please. Michelle Anderson is an HIV advocate who has become politically active, trying to give people with HIV, and specifically Black women living with HIV, a voice in the political process. Next picture. We have Katina, who, quite frankly, she faced stigma from within her own family and confronted it, and now she's in college. And then last picture, please. It's so important that people living with HIV be seen. And one of the things that we've tried to address with this campaign is if we're asking people to basically out themselves and to reveal their HIV status. But how they take part in the campaign is up to them. And while Irene couldn't show herself, she at least wanted to take part in the campaign, and this was the picture that she sent in. Real quick, there's a picture that was sent in a few years ago by a young man in Brazil who told the story about how he used to enjoy as a boy dancing with his mother. The day that he disclosed his HIV status to his mother was a day with HIV that year, and they danced together. And the picture that he took and sent to us was a picture of him holding his mother's hand. It was just the two hands as they were dancing. She accepted him living with HIV. So there's a power behind the pictures. The pictures give people the opportunity to tell their stories and own their lives and to be seen. So that's it.
That was amazing, Rick. I'll just echo what the chat said. It was the most goosebumps I've had in a conference panel before, with all these great stories from Larry and Kristin's work. This is amazing. Do we have time, Emily, for a question or two from the chat?
Yeah, I think so. I kind of wanted to just reflect the general enthusiasm from the chat and ask you, Rick, are there ways that people can get involved or promote this campaign in their own spheres?
Well, we're trying to figure out how to make the campaign go beyond a day. We do have a website, adaywithhiv.com. It's all one word, where you can see the online gallery of some of the pictures that were taken on that day. And if I can throw in a plug, we actually have a webinar for World AIDS Day coming up. It's going to take place on Tuesday, November 30th, 5 o'clock Eastern Time, 10 p.m. GMT, where we're going to feature some of the people who took pictures for a day with HIV, including some of the people that you saw here. And if you don't mind, in the chat, I will put in a link where people can register for the webinar. I prefer not to call it a webinar. I'm calling it more of a virtual celebration of the pictures, stories, and people behind the Day with HIV. So you'll be hearing not only from recognized advocates, but also people, just regular people living with HIV. What I like to say, the tagline that I like to say for a Day with HIV is that it is everyday moments in the lives of extraordinary people, because they all are.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was really wonderful. And I saw that you put in the chat the link, and I put that in the Whova chat as well. So hopefully folks who are tuned in either way can have access to that link. And with that, I'll pass it over to Alicia to kind of lead us in some discussion and reflection.
Oh, well, that is, I think maybe we all need a moment to just sort of catch our breath and think about all that Rick has said and Larry has said and Kristin has said and how it relates to whatever all 100+ of us are doing and thinking in our own lives. Thank you so much to our panel and Joe to your facilitation and Emily to your facilitation overall. I mean, these virtual conferences are amazing in how they can help us connect, but also really a challenge to connect sometimes. And really appreciate everybody's work. When we decided that we would have a discussant, I'm not going to like go on. We just thought that it might be helpful to take a moment and think about both the unique things that everybody has said and some common like themes or patterns. And then we'll open it up for broader discussion, although it's okay to ask questions of particular panelists as well. You know, one thing that, so this panel, sorry, my computer just jumped. I just was putting a bit of information in the chat that this panel was created through people who take part in the Internalized Stigma interest group. And that's related to my comments because there, as on this panel, a lot of us are involved in either mental health related stigma issues, HIV related stigma issues, and other things, acknowledging that, of course, there are unique aspects to each sort of marginalized or stigmatized health condition or identity, but also, as several people said in the chat and in their presentations, so much commonality. And so as we try to figure out how to reduce the burden of internalized stigma, you know, we really want to pay attention to that creative dynamic or something between there's common principles, there's common experiences, there's common principles of what can help, but also paying attention to the huge unique aspects of each individual's experience, but also the sort of dynamics of stigma around different situations and different stigmatized conditions or identities. And so I just saw a lot of that in your presentations and in the comments in the chat, that it's that dynamic between commonalities of ways we can tackle this and the unique aspects that I think have a lot of promise, is like holding on to both of them and not one or the other. And that relates to effective strategies. It relates to the two-edged sword of concealment, you know, that sometimes it allows one to skirt some harsh experiences, but it also brings that feeling of vulnerability and secrecy to, you know, so this dynamic seems to be something that, the two-sided, you know, that ties together a lot of what you all have said. And the other thing that I was really struck by is that same idea drawn forward to the strengths of intersectionality as well as the difficulties. So the idea that we all live multiple identities at once, and they have a lot of burden from societal oppression, also privilege at times from, you know, societal oppression, and that within that is a lot of stress, of course, but also there's that commonality of lived experience, of connecting with people who have similar experiences, similar life paths, and that from that the peer and the self-help strengths that intersectionality can be part of that, as well as sort of a heaping on of oppression. And I really was thinking about that when Greg, you were talking about how dangerous stigma was for you. And Rick, you touched on that too. I've come to talk about internalized stigma as using these words like danger and risk and fatal, because often it's sort of, when we do talk about it, it's framed in this idea of just being unfair and not nice. And I think it goes way beyond that. But also on the other side of that, because it is so dangerous, is that importance of self-compassion, of pushing it away. And that starts within oneself, but then extends to the community. So I think just trying to think for myself how all of what you all have talked about is so big that can't really think about it all at once. but this dynamic between the commonality and the unique aspects that both for the burden of internalized stigma and for the tools that gives us to help each other navigate it and try to thrive despite the fact that it does not necessarily go away from society, is what I was left with. So I hope that at least gives everyone a moment to pause and think about big picture. And I think we should move to some questions. Emily, did you want to bring up questions from the chat, or did you want me to, or how do you prefer to do that?
Either way, if you have made note of some, that's perfect. Otherwise, I have some as well.
Okay, well, let's sure, go ahead. If you have things you've already picked, let's go ahead. And
Sure.
I mean, I see there's new ones, and it's, that's one of the awkward things about this kind of technology, is how do we can't just sit around with a cup of tea and chat. So forgive us, everyone, the dynamics of this, but go ahead.
Yeah, so one question that we got through the Whova chat was asking if internalized stigma can be transferable to family members.
And please, this is to our panelists, but also we know there's a lot of wisdom and experience and good work amongst the many other people who are attending. So do not be shy about weighing in on, on your views.
So the question, can internalized stigma be transferred? Can you repeat it again, please?
Sure. Yeah, so can internalized stigma be transferable to family members?
Absolutely. It can be transferred to family members. It can also, family members can also be, help reinforce the stigma as well. Sometimes it can be both. So I know myself, when I first disclosed, the first person I disclosed my HIV status to outside of the Red Cross physician who diagnosed me, was my mom. And I basically told her out of exhaustion, because after 5 years, I was just tired of carrying that. And the only thing I remember through crying and just my tears and just kind of really, in crisis mode, was just how calm and present she was. That was from my perspective. Now I know she went upstairs during that time and like for a couple minutes, and she probably did her own thing, cried or whatever. But when she came out, she was always, and my family, my siblings, my family have always been supportive of me. What I haven't had, but a lot of other individuals have had, is being able to diagnose or to disclose to their family members, and then immediately their family members go out into the world and aren't as comfortable sharing it or supporting it or having that the knowledge or ability to be able to have a conversation around HIV or around these kind of the impacts that affect. So sometimes it can be torturous, where I've seen individuals who were diagnosed with HIV living in, I think, rural Alabama, before telling or after telling their church members, after telling their family, he had to leave. He had to leave the state. He left the country, moved to Canada, because his own family could not, would rather not accept him as a son, as a brother. His church would not accept him as a member of the congregation because he was living with HIV. He was gay. He was Black, living in Alabama, all these different things. So he left that and went to Canada. So absolutely, yes, it can work both ways.
If I may add to that, because what Larry said just now really struck me. But the thing about stigma is that while it is placed on us, it's not a reflection of us. The people who stigmatize, it's a reflection on them. So the kind of person who stigmatizes another, it's a reflection of the ignorance the prejudice,
Mhm.
maybe even the hate that they have, the small-mindedness. That's not on you, that's them.
And I fully agree with that. I will add, not to contradict, but in the moment, you can feel so helpless. Yeah, you have to process. I mean, I've been living with HIV for over 35, 36 years now, and I'm still feeling those kind of, I don't know if you want to call it PTSD, but just those like, ugh, just those memories of that pain and those stories. Yeah.
Do other people have thoughts on that, on family and internalized stigma? I mean, it's powerful stuff.
I'll just chime in. I should probably start out my presentations with this, and I maybe need to do that more often. Why I started doing the work that I'm doing, and it was because of my own family's experiences with stigma. A close sibling has a serious mental illness, and to this day, it's kind of ironic. I'm a stigma researcher. My family knows what I do for a living. They support my work. They donate to This Is My Grave, right? But they still experience this incredible sense of burden because they've internalized the belief that my siblings' experiences are somehow their fault. And so I think that's part of, I label this in my work as affiliate stigma. So it's the stigma experienced by people who don't have the condition but are affiliated with the individual. So I've just observed personally how powerful that can be, and how lifelong it can be, even with some intervention. Like it definitely does affect families deeply. So I just wanted to share that.
And maybe there was also a really good question just from someone about how faith factors into this. And you started mentioning that, Larry. Maybe we should go there next. Do you have something that you wanted to start with?
Yeah, so the question was, has faith been of any help? I saw Rick answer this in the chat as well. And I said in the chat very briefly, like, not necessarily. I mean, I grew up as a member of a Baptist church here in Alexandria, and I remember being, and this is like broadly just church and religion in general, but it's also kind of connected to how stigma and misinformation and that kind of pressure can be internalized and replicated. But I remember church early on, the conversations were open. Like, you were encouraged to ask questions. You were encouraged to be open and to have discussions about faith and ask questions. But then it changed at some point where religion became a reason to end conversations, and it's further stigmatized. There, like I just mentioned, their own people in congregations. And I have read and seen and know personally people who have been the worst pain and pressure, stigma, fear, ignorance, however you want to call it, that they've experienced have come from the pulpit, have come from the congregation, have come from their church members, their church family. And so this is not a condemnation of religion as a whole, but obviously there are individuals in church or affiliated with churches who use religion, who use their faith to further cover individuals, cover communities in some cases, with that label of evil, that label of whether it's a broad sin or just further denigrate and demoralize individuals who are experiencing that pain, whether they're living with HIV, whether it's around sexuality, whether it's around socioeconomic status. All these things can be shunned or can be exasperated just by going to church.
And that's really true. And really sorry, everybody, we're running out of time. And I just want to invite everybody to connect with each other. We don't have to stop here. And I put in the chat that this is part of an Internalized Stigma interest group so that we can stay connected. But of course, that's just one way. You can also connect with each other. And we just wanted to ask if anybody had some closing questions that come from the question that Dr. Rana posted a while ago, that there are a lot of commonalities across stigma of all conditions and illnesses and identities. Closing thoughts on how we can work together? Anybody? Panelists or others?
Well, Alicia, real quick, I just want to respond to Larry. I totally get what you're saying, and I'm appalled when I see it. I call that the misuse of religion. My parents are very religious. As Mexicans, we are practicing Roman Catholics. I'm still a practicing Roman Catholic. My mom knew for years, decades, before I disclosed my status to her and my dad. And so I asked her, well, how do you reconcile your Catholic faith with the fact that you've got an HIV positive gay son? And she said, oh, that's easy. God is love and love is of God. How could I not love you? So if your religion, whatever the faith is, if your faith is not grounded in love and compassion, that's the misuse of religion.
Well, final thoughts. We're at 5 till and we're supposed to end then, so people have transition time. Thank you, everybody, for your comments, for your participation as audience members, for your facilitation, and we can take this off, outside of this session. You can look in the chat for emails of various folks, and I've put mine a couple of times because we can help you if you want to connect to our interest group. I guess we should end, eh?
Yes, and one more big thank you to our 3 speakers today. Thank you so much for sharing your work, your personal experiences, your perspectives. It's been wonderful.
And thank you to the organizing and facilitation.
Couldn't do without you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I loved hearing your stories, Larry and Rick.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.